I am Seraphin Losnick. Just moved into the area, started coming here as Holy Lady of Kazan about 2 months ago. Graduated from seminary quite a few years ago. I was a Bible teacher. I taught 4 different classes, 2 on Old Testament, 2 on New Testament. Taught ancient Greek. I was going to teach Hebrew, but people weren't interested, so ended up being just Greek. So, and I've pretty much devoted my life to studying theology. Started out as a Protestant, became a Calvinist, became Orthodox about 13 years ago through the grace of God. So hopefully this provides some value to everybody. So I wanted to start first with encouraging you to ask questions. So if I'm talking too fast, if I'm not being clear, feel free to put up your hand and say whatever you're wondering about. Don't hesitate to interrupt. That's not a problem at all. So we're going to start with a prehistory of the people of God, leading up to the time of the councils. So 325 was the first ecumenical council, and as Silouan pointed out, it didn't just pop out of nowhere. There was lots of questioning, lots of heresy, lots of arguments and debates leading up to it, which brought about its necessity. So it's important to start with understanding the mindset of people. And really, people don't change. You go back 2,000 years, and someone who's part of the church, most people aren't experts in their faith. They have a basic idea, general understanding of their faith. And it was even more difficult then, because people in the church didn't have the glory of what we have now, where we can say, pick any doctrine. We can say, well, this is what the church has always believed and practiced. We can rest on that. Whereas in the past, there was all kinds of different things coming from different directions. So I apologize. I just realized how fast I was going. So I'm going to go way back and start with Adam. I promise it won't be long. But when Adam and Eve sinned, a certain pattern started with how God and man interacted. So basically, so Adam was sinless. He chose to rebel. He chose to do what he thought was best by believing the serpent's lie. And when he did that, of course, he was kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And this is when this pattern starts. The man that God raised up fell into sin. And then the people that he was supposed to be leading followed him in that sinful tendency. And it ended up with God needing to flood the earth and basically start over. So the man of God, raised up by God, put in place by God, he falls into sin. The people he's leading follow him into that sin, and then there's this drastic consequence of that sin. So, and we see that 6 times happen throughout the history of the people of God. So we see it again with Noah, which for him it was the big consequence was the Tower of Babel. So originally when God called man, it was go out and populate the earth. Well, they chose, no, we're going to stay here in this one little place in the land of Shinar. And so basically God confused their language, and that forced them to spread out. So what looked like a punishment was actually an encouragement, a force to obey. So, like I said, that pattern continued over and over again 6 different times. The last time this happened was after David and Solomon were the kings of Israel. And there was multiple kings after them, and the nation split at that point into Judah and Israel. And they fallen into idolatry. Solomon was, even though he was the wisest man, his example was really bad. He married foreign wives. He was making himself incredibly wealthy. He was gathering up armies, all this sort of thing. And eventually, when the nation split, the Assyrians overthrew the northern tribes, and then Babylon eventually overthrew the southern 2 tribes. And they went off into captivity. And at that point, Israel ceased to be a people. They were just slaves at this point. Interestingly, the Assyrians and the Babylonians had 2 different ways of dealing with their slaves. So the Assyrians would capture people from various places and mix them up, whereas the Babylonians would just take them into captivity. So that's where we get the Samaritans from. So the Assyrians took all of these different mixtures of people and put them up in northern Israel, and that brought about a mixture, a melting pot, you would have, of beliefs. So you get different ideas coming in contrary to the religion of Judaism. So Israel ceased to exist. For 70 years, they were in Babylonian captivity. And technically, they came out of that captivity, but they were still slaves. So from that point up until the incarnation was about 600 years. And Israel was never free at that point. Through that whole period of time, they were under, of course, the Babylonians. Then the Persians rose to power and overthrew and took control of Israel. And then, I'm pulling my notes. The Greeks were next, and then finally the Romans, who we all know were in charge when Jesus was born. So, in all of this time, the Israelites, as we see from their genealogies, were very, very concerned about, okay, who's the Messiah going to be? When's he going to show up? Are we going to recognize him? So they were watching for their Messiah. But in their mind, David was like the ultimate king. He clearly did a very, very good job in leading. Wasn't a very good father, but when they were looking for their Messiah, they were looking for someone who would rise up, military power, overthrow the enemies, and give them back their freedom as the nation of Israel. So they were looking for military strength and political freedom. And that mindset of when will you restore the kingdom to Israel? We see that all the way up to the ascension. So at the very beginning of Acts, right before Jesus ascends, the apostles ask him, is this now when you will restore the kingdom to Israel? So they were still thinking in terms of, we're going to overthrow the Romans, we're going to become an independent power, we're going to be on top again. At this point, the Apostle Paul was still a Pharisee. He was still, they say, breathing murderous threats against the Christians, against the church. And it wasn't until his conversion that with his encyclopedic knowledge of the Old Testament. He was the Pharisee of Pharisees, as he called himself. It was with his conversion that most of the New Testament started being written. The epistles most were written by Paul, and he worked out and explained all these intricacies. We see it especially in the book of Romans. So he goes through and he explains how Jesus was the high priest, or Jesus is the high priest, and he is the true type of all these images, all these pictures we see in the Old Covenant. So it was his work that really started moving the church into a strong point, a place where they understood their faith.
The Paul, you mean Apostle Paul?
Yes. So in all of this, leading up to the First Ecumenical Council, it's important to remember that people were still in a place where they were hearing lots of different things. There was no Bible as we speak of it. They had the Old Testament, which I really doubt anybody, I know I can't defend Christ's position as the Messiah from strictly Old Testament passages. That'd be very difficult to do. But that's what they had. And they had to rely on a lot of explaining imagery, explaining types and pictures. So, unlike us, they didn't have the luxury of doctrinal stability or church authority. So, the incarnation took place. It's understood that the Gospel of Matthew was the first one that was written, and that was probably in the mid to late 30s. And then most academics are under the impression that there was about a 10-year period with each gospel writing. So Mark was next. And Mark is interesting because instead of a linear storytelling, like normally when we tell a story, we say, you know, so-and-so did this, and they did this, and then they did this. The Gospel of Mark is written focused on Jesus' movement. When you read through the Gospel, it's all about he went here and then he went there, and it's out of order when you look at the Gospel of Matthew, which is where Mark got his source data from. Luke was written after that, probably in the 50s. And then John in the 60s. John is very, very Greek in its approach. Lots of philosophical concepts and that sort of thing. So it's, for someone just learning the gospel, John is not a good place to start unless you're really philosophically minded. And then the epistles and the book of Revelation were written in the next 2 decades, so the 50s and 60s were when these letters were written. So it's important to remember that when Paul wrote these, he was dealing with specific groups of people, like the church in Corinth. Okay, they're having these issues. I need to explain these things. I need to, guide them in the Christian way. And the book of Revelation prophesied the coming destruction, and it's essentially the book of Revelation is like what they call Daniel Part 2. Whereas, so Daniel, the book of Daniel ended, it's very strange as well when you read it. Lots of bizarre animals and violence and things going on. And that book ends with keep these things hidden, don't explain them, which seems unusual. But the book of Revelation, as the name says, is about revealing. So when Christ gave that to John, the idea was, I'm going to show you how the old covenant is going to end. And this is a revelation, a revealing of what people can expect. So with that destruction, just like the flood, great destruction came because of sin. After Abraham, when the people of God went into Egyptian slavery, every time Israel lost its identity, they became slaves. They weren't Israel anymore. They were absorbed by other nations, whatever. So the book of Revelation shows how when those who rejected Christ as the Messiah, it shows how they met their end. Basically, the revelation is Israel not being a nation anymore, not being a people anymore, because the church is now the people of God. So with the destruction of the temple, which was everything, that was the temple, was what Judaism was centered on. That was its foundation. For the people of God in the Old Covenant to be part of the people of God, you had the sacrificial system, you had Mosaic law.
I got lost a little. You're talking about the temple of the Old Testament.
Yes. Yeah. So when that was destroyed in the AD 70, the year 70, by the Romans. And with that destruction, Israel basically lost everything. That's what defined them. And what's really interesting is that when that happened, the Jews turned their focus from the sacrificial system to following the law. And Judaism really kind of splintered at that point. The Jews began following after certain teachers, rabbis. And it's very similar to what's happened in Western Christendom, where Rome broke away, and then the Protestant Reformation happened, and then there was just this terrible splintering of people following after teachers instead of following the authority of the church. So it's interesting as well, because when you read through the epistles, Paul constantly is driving home the point that we're not saved by law. We don't. The law is not where salvation is. And it's interesting that the Jews, that's the direction they went, was after the law. So their faith became that specifically of not following Jesus, which is a pretty horrible position to take. When you speak with a lot of Protestants today, they still think of the Jews as God's people, which is very odd since they rejected him. So when the epistles, when the letters to these different churches were being written, they would go to the church, they would read it for the congregation, and then over time, as they started wearing out, they would make copies, and they get sent around for people to share, for people to understand. And for decades, this was going on. Many copies were being made. Obviously, we don't have the originals anymore. We have bits of copies. And there was an interesting way of writing in those days. We would call it plagiarism now. Back then, if you believed that you understood, say, the Apostle Paul's message, you could write a letter and sign it the Apostle Paul if you believed that you were being faithful to what he was teaching. And it was accepted. That was an okay thing to do. But it introduced a lot of errors because people were not always accurate in what they were teaching. So, as Paul mentions in Acts later on, he says, I think it was at Pentecost we read this passage, fierce wolves will arise among you within the church. And so basically he was warning about false teachers are going to come up, and we need to be careful. We need to pay attention to what they're saying. And one of the biggest issues at the time was something called Gnosticism. And that idea didn't originate with Christianity. Gnosticism? Right, did not originate within the church. So the Gnostics believed that the God of the Old Testament was one God, and he was a kind of an ogre, a mean, violent monster. And then there was the God of the New Testament. So they saw two different gods there. And because the God of the Old Testament was responsible for creation, and because he was a monster, material things were therefore evil. So their perspective, their way of looking at the world was, we're trapped in this physical body. It's bad. We don't want to be here. We need to escape that. And so they were looking through a real spiritualized way of life, where mystical insight, hidden knowledge, these kind of things, which is strangely popular today. So physical reality was an illusion, and we needed to look through and try to achieve enlightenment was their goal. So to make matters worse, there were groups that called themselves Christians that embraced aspects of Gnosticism, and that was causing a lot of confusion, of course. And for the Gnostic, reality was private interpretation and individual experience. So if you had some sort of wonderful, enlightening, feel-good experience, that was your truth, as they would say now. The church pretty quickly labeled Gnosticism as heretical. And when you think about, so Pentecost, 33 AD up to 100, so less than 70 years, there was already this much confusion and error going on. And it's really not different from what we're facing today. The Christianity that's most common in the United States is sadly not Orthodoxy, but it's not even really Protestantism anymore.
Non-denominational nonsense.
Non-denominational nonsense, there you go. Yes. So make it up as you go. Believe whatever makes you feel best is kind of the approach today. And then there's a new rise now of paganism that's becoming very, very popular. And then there's other religions that call themselves Christian. Jehovah's Witnesses, Latter-day Saints, these kind of groups, they take that label and it just introduces confusion. And you can see it in Hollywood, right? When you watch a movie and they're making fun of Christians, it's never Orthodox people they're mocking. It's the people that knock on your door and want to give you literature and those sort of things. So the difference would be we have the apostolic faith. We have 2,000 years of tradition. Whereas, like I said, in the first 3 centuries, they didn't. They didn't even have a Bible to appeal to. So that's a good image. It's called a Venn diagram. So if you think of a big circle, and we'll call that Christianity, or the Christian apostolic faith. As Orthodox, we would say a smaller circle inside of that with Bible is the right way to think about our faith. Whereas anybody else completely separates those two concepts. A minister I used to be friends with, Protestant minister, he argued that he never appeals to the ecumenical councils as authority. He appeals to the Bible, and if the councils agree with it, great, then that's fine. Which is a surprisingly ignorant position to take, since it was the church that put the Bible together, that recognized it. A really good way to think about how the Bible came to be. It was not a random idea of, well, this sounds right, or that sounds okay, or that sounds true. When the church fathers looked at all these different texts, and there was a lot of them, a lot of different, there was more than 4 gospels, there were many other gospels written, and when they looked at these gospels, they asked the question, does this agree with what we've always practiced and believed? So that needs to be our foundation, not it's not a matter of, I think the text means this. It's, this text is saying, whatever the doctrine is, what has the church always said about that teaching? So the authority of the church is where we need to be. So for about the first 300 years, there was no canon. There was oral teaching, a lot of that. The apostles talked about many other things that Jesus taught after his resurrection and before the ascension. He was teaching the apostles, and there was many things that weren't written down that were passed on orally. And when the apostles died, all of them except for one were martyred. There was obviously a next generation that came up. People like Clement of Rome. He wrote an epistle called First Clement, which was a letter from the Church of Rome to the church in Corinth. There's a text called the Didache, which was, they don't know who wrote it, but it was supposed to be kind of like a catechism. It was a series of questions and answers. It was meant to teach Christian doctrine. There's the epistle of Barnabas. That epistle almost made it into the Bible. It was very allegorical, lots of imagery. The author, he went to the Old Testament and he tried to pull all those stories and put a Christian, a New Testament understanding on them, which would have been really helpful. But there was enough error in it that the fathers rejected. Ignatius of Antioch, the bishop there, he wrote 7 different epistles. It was around the year 100 when he did this. And even at that time, so like I said, within 70 years of the incarnation, or of the resurrection, there was faulty teaching going around where some were teaching that Jesus was just a physical man, or Jesus was just an angel. They like to appeal to the angel Michael as a Christ type, or as the Christ. And then there were those that taught that Jesus was just another human teacher, which is where the Jehovah's Witnesses are today. That's their. He was just a teacher. I think Islam has the same view as well. He was just another prophet. There is Polycarp of Smyrna. He wrote epistles. Papias of Hierapolis. This was a collection of sayings that he attributed to Christ. And within that text, he references the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark. And then the Shepherd of Hermas is another one that almost made it into the Bible. The interesting thing about these other texts is just because they're not canon doesn't mean they're worthless. But a person does need to know their faith well if they're going to look to these writings, so they don't pick up something faulty. So the point of all that is to show that the apostles handing off the faith to the next generation, it was not just it wasn't stagnant. It didn't just stop there. These men continued to teach. They continued to write. They continued to promote the faith, and they were attempting to repeat what the apostles had taught them. Most of it was good. There was some error, and the error was coming from errors like Gnosticism. There was even some Buddhist ideas that were sneaking into the Middle East. Buddhism precedes Christianity by about 5 centuries. So it had been around. So the really amazing thing about Christianity when it came on, when it rose up, was that it presented itself very, very differently than any other faith the world had ever seen. So, for the Jew and the Jewish worldview, and you can see it when you read the epistles, the idea was it's about ethnicity, it's about following this set of rules, whereas Christianity was not a nation. It was not about being Jewish. It was not about not being Gentile. Being a slave, being free, didn't matter. There were men that were put into positions as bishop that had been slaves, which was unheard of. That would be highly inappropriate in the ancient world. For the church, community was central. And you could see that love of community with its constant repetition, its constant expressions of peace and charity. So, something that the church did early on, beginning around 175, small councils began being formed. So this idea of, okay, we're seeing this problem in this area. Let's get the religious leaders together and discuss this and figure out how we're going to address this problem. And they got that idea from Roman law. And we see this much later on in the church where, like the three Cappadocians, Basil, were taking ideas from different philosophies and they were Christianizing them. They were finding truth where it was and they were putting it within a Christian framework. So this idea of having councils was taken from, again, the world and used to address problems, address errors that were coming up. So the first council in 175 was in Phrygia, and there was a teacher, Montanus was his name, and he was teaching extreme asceticism and apocalypticism. So the idea that basically, if you take Orthodox monasticism and then extend it to an extreme, like borderline starvation level, don't wear any clothes, live in a hole in the ground, don't eat anything unless it's weeds, that sort of approach. And then the apocalypticism is this idea that, the world's ending tomorrow, the world's ending at the end of the year. And we're seeing that today with so much of modern American evangelicalism. It seems like since the 60s, every decade or so, somebody comes up with this idea of, Jesus is returning next year. And it just keeps going and going. So this man, Montanus, was doing this. He was stirring up problems. He was imposing law on people that was not what the church had always practiced. In 190, another council was held in Rome for calculating the date of Pascha. In around 250, in Antioch, a council was held for Emperor Decius put a law in place that basically said you have to sacrifice or make an offering to this old god, whatever the god was. And if you didn't, you would be imprisoned, you'd be executed, whatever it was. And of course, Christians could not do that. Unfortunately, some did. Some gave in and apostatized. And when he put this in place, if you were to make that sacrifice, it had to be in front of a government official, and you had to get a signed document saying that you did this. Then you could go and live your life. Fortunately, many did not and died for their faith. Interestingly, Jews were exempt from this law because Judaism was so old. They basically got the grandfather clause, and Christianity was not really seen as a religion at this time. It was this weird Jewish offshoot, as they thought of it, and they thought of Christians as troublemakers. They were they're causing issues within society. Whenever something bad would come up, like a plague or a tornado or earthquake, they'd blame it on the Christians. The gods are angry because the Christians are not worshiping like they're supposed to. So this idea of councils became more and more the norm for dealing with localized issues. They were small. There was a synod, they called it, in 306 in Spain. There was 19 bishops there, small group. And it was focused mainly on the behavior of priests. Were they allowed to get married? What should a Christian marriage look like? In 264, another council was held where Paul of Samosata, it was his name, he was teaching that there was no Trinity, that the Holy Spirit was just an energy force, and that Jesus was just a man. So that basically obliterates the Trinity. And there was many different views about who Jesus was, about what he was. Some said that the Trinity was like water. So sometimes it could be solid, like ice. Sometimes it could be a gas. Sometimes it could be liquid. And they tried to use that imagery to describe God, which the church rejected as not true. And then another popular one was called adoptionism, where Jesus was just a man and then God adopted him and granted him deityhood, similar to like Greek thinking or Roman thinking about their gods. So, in general, the Christian faith was by no means following an easy path. They were facing persecution from the ancient religions, from the Jews. They were facing all kinds of confusion and errant teaching within the church. And they were so different from everybody else, from any other religion in the past, and they promoted themselves. That the church presented itself as not just a new moral system. It was in a sense it was easy to be a Jew because you had the rituals that you followed. You had the law written out for you. Basically, just follow the rules, and you'll be a good Jew. Christianity did not have that. They didn't have this idea of, here's your list, obey it. Jesus summarized it very nicely to the Pharisees during his ministry when he said, you need to love God, you need to love your neighbor. So within Protestantism, there's a fairly heated debate about what place does the law fit for the Christian. And there's lots of different views, lots of different ideas about following the law. But there's no need for that because Jesus fulfilled it all. We just need to love. When we interact with different people, they're going to need different, how do you say it? Different responses from us. Some people are very weak. Some people are very analytical. They need to be loved in different ways. And that's where being mature comes in. So we've not been called to follow rules. We've been called to a relationship with God through Jesus Christ in his church that is filled and led by the Holy Spirit. So, in one sense, it's much easier to be a Christian than to be a Jew, because imagine going through life where you had somebody standing over you saying, you need to do this, oh, don't do that, hit you on the knuckles, kind of like when you were a child. Like mom and dad are there to train you and lead you in the way you should go. But if you're 35 years old and mom and dad are still training you, something's not right there. So in the same way, our Christian life should be that mature adult life where we are acting in love and we are striving towards holiness. So this idea of community is why the Eucharist is so central to our faith. We gather together, and we could go anywhere in the world where there's an Orthodox church, and that's our family. We partake of one meal. It's relationship, not law. So, to summarize all of that, so for 300 years there was no official canon. There was nothing to appeal to say, well, that's not what the Bible teaches, like here today. We see that even though the writings of the apostles were widely being circulated, there was also many other texts that were being written, that were being circulated as well. And these claimed to be apostolic, even if it was just apostolic in spirit, there was a lot of error. There was a lot of false teaching. And there were other groups claiming the title Christian like we see today. And that caused confusion, that caused problems. And we're going to see those when we go into these first councils. And then the problem of other religions introduce people picking up false teaching from other faiths was confusing thing, and philosophical systems as well. They were an influence. We don't see it as much today in ourselves when we go out into the world. The way our culture talks, the music they listen to, the things they watch on TV, the way they dress, all these things are influencing us. And we need to be really attentive to what we're taking in. We should be asking ourselves, is this kind of behavior or these thoughts what the church has always practiced and believed? So in spite of all that mess that the church grew up in, the apostolic faith continued to grow, and great effort was being made to clarify doctrine, to clarify practice, and to address how to basically how to address error. So finally, the church was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was not localized, it was not ethnic, it was not gender-based, one of the two genders. And it had no economic boundaries. So you could be a slave, you could be terribly, terribly poor, you could be extremely wealthy. None of that mattered. When you've been baptized into the church, you are one of the body of Christ. And it should not be the case that the wealthy in a congregation run things. You see this in too many circumstances where someone will donate a large amount of money and be like, oh, I want it to be used for this. When if you're donating, it's not yours anymore, so you shouldn't impose your view, shouldn't impose your preferences. So the authorities in the church saw the value of organized debate and discussion, which they took from the Roman law system. They understood that we can't just pick a couple people and impose law, impose rule on them. When the ecumenical councils were formed, we're talking hundreds of people, bishops, religious leaders gathering together and discussing, working through these questions. So the church has learned to take truth where it is, Christianize it, recognize it within the framework of the apostolic faith, and then use it for the good of growing the church, maturing the church, and basically taking dominion over the world.